The morning Owen Abbott rode into Caldwell, Kansas with Winifred Easton's wrists bound to his saddle horn, half the town turned out to watch, and not a single soul among them knew they were witnessing the beginning of something that would change both their lives beyond all recognition. It was the autumn of 1878, and the prairie wind was doing what it always did in October, cutting straight through a person like it had a grudge to settle. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, a place built on cattle dust and whiskey fumes, and the kind of justice that came fast and loose and rarely asked questions. Owen had ridden through worse towns and brought in worse people, and he told himself this job was no different from any other. He told himself that every mile of the 43 he'd covered to find her. Winifred Easton sat upright on the borrowed roan mare he'd found her riding, her dark auburn hair whipped loose from its pins, her green eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance like she was already somewhere else entirely. She had not cried. She had not begged. She had not tried to run since the first hour, when she'd made one clean attempt at breaking east across the creek bed, and he'd cut her off at the ravine with a patience that surprised even him. After that, she had simply ridden beside him with a kind of dignity that unsettled him more than resistance would have. Owen was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something interesting rather than handsome, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone as the Kansas bluffs, dark eyes that moved constantly, cataloging, assessing. He had been doing this work for 6 years. He was good at it. He did not particularly enjoy it, which he believed made him better at it than the men who did. The warrant he carried named Winifred Easton as an accomplice in the robbery of the First Commerce Bank of Hays City on September 14th. The robbery had resulted in the death of a bank teller named Robert Greer, 24 years old, recently married. The man who had pulled the trigger was named Dale Cutter, a small-time outlaw with a large-time reputation for violence. The bounty on Winifred Easton was $300, dead or alive. The bounty on Dale Cutter was $500, and nobody had collected it yet. Sheriff Burl Hanson met them in the street outside his office, his thumbs hooked in his belt and his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who has ordered something from a catalog and watched it arrive on schedule. "That her?" Hanson said, though it was clearly rhetorical. "Winifred Easton," Owen said, swinging down from his horse and handing the reins to a boy who materialized from nowhere, as boys in frontier towns always did. "Found her at the Mallory homestead, about 12 miles east of Medicine Lodge. Hiding out with family. No family connection I could find. She'd offered to work for room and board." The Mallory woman said she'd been there 4 days, helping with the harvest. Hanson squinted up at Winifred, who was still sitting on the mare with her bound hands resting in her lap. "Get her down," he said. Owen reached up and helped her dismount, not roughly, not gently, just functionally. Her feet hit the dirt and she straightened her back and looked at Sheriff Hanson with those green eyes, and something flickered in them that Owen caught and filed away. It was not fear. It was not defiance. It was something that looked, uncomfortably, like the particular exhaustion of someone who has been trying very hard to explain something that nobody will hear. "Sheriff," she said, and her voice was steady and clear, the accent carrying traces of somewhere that had started east and been roughed up by years of westward movement. "I would like to speak with you about the charges against me." "You can speak all you like from inside a cell," Hanson said, and jerked his chin at his deputy, a red-faced young man named Tillies who had the eager look of a dog waiting to be thrown a stick. Owen untied her wrists himself. It seemed the decent thing to do before Tillies got his hands on the rope. The cell was in the back of the sheriff's office, iron-barred and smelling of old hay and older trouble. Winifred walked into it without being pushed, and Owen watched the door clang shut behind her and told himself that his business here was concluded. He collected his papers from Hanson, signed where required, and accepted the promise of his $300 in the morning when the bank opened. He went to the Drover's Rest Hotel, which was the better of Caldwell's 2 establishments and still not particularly good, and he paid for a room and a bath and a meal, in that order of priority. He sat at the small table in the dining room with a plate of beef and potatoes, and tried to remember the last thing he'd eaten that tasted like someone had given it thought. He ate mechanically and did not think about Winifred Easton's eyes. He thought about them anyway. He ordered a whiskey and then did not drink it, just turned the glass in his hands. There was something wrong about this job. That was the thought that kept surfacing, the way a piece of timber keeps bobbing back up no matter how many times you push it underwater. He had brought people in before who were guilty of exactly what their warrants said. He had brought people in who were innocent of their specific charge, but guilty of enough other things that justice was more or less served in a general way. He had twice in 6 years brought someone in and later learned he had been wrong, and those 2 occasions lived in him like splinters that had gone too deep to remove. He was not certain this was a 3rd time, but he was not certain it was not. The thing was, in his 43 miles riding beside Winifred Easton, he had watched her. It was his habit and his profession to watch people, and what he had seen did not assemble itself into the picture of a woman who had stood beside a man and covered the door while he held a gun on bank employees. She had asked him 3 times to let her explain. The first time he had said it wasn't his place to hear explanations, only to deliver her to the law. The second time she had said quietly, "That is a very convenient way to avoid responsibility for what you do," and he had not had an answer for that. The third time she had not asked but had simply begun talking, and he had said, louder than he needed to, that she should save it for the sheriff, and after that she had gone silent and stayed silent. But he had heard the beginning of it. Just the beginning. She had said, "I was there because Dale Cutter told me my brother was inside." He set down the whiskey glass without drinking from it and went to bed and lay there staring at the ceiling until sometime past midnight, when he made a decision that he knew was going to cost him something, though he did not yet know how much. In the morning, he collected his $300 from the bank and went to the sheriff's office, and he did something he had never done in 6 years of this work. He asked to speak with his prisoner. Hanson looked at him with the particular suspicion that small-town sheriffs reserved for anyone who seemed to be making their lives complicated. "What for?" "Loose ends," Owen said, "on the Cutter matter. She may have information about where he's running." This was true as far as it went. It also was not the whole truth, but Owen had found that partial truths worked better than outright lies in situations like this, because they allowed the other man to fill in the rest with his own assumptions, and people were generally willing to believe what suited them. Hanson shrugged and waved him through. Winifred was sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands folded in her lap, looking precisely as she had looked when she rode into town, contained, exhausted, holding herself together with something that was mostly will. She had slept in her clothes and her hair was coming down further, and there was a smudge of dust on her left cheekbone, and she looked up when he came in and said nothing, just watched him. Owen pulled a 3-legged stool from the corner of the room and sat down across from the cell bars and put his hat on his knee. "Tell me about your brother," he said. She studied him for a long moment. He could see her deciding whether to trust this, deciding whether it was a trick or a trap or simply another version of no one listening. "His name is Thomas Easton," she said. "He is 22 years old. He fell in with Dale Cutter's outfit about 8 months ago when he was working a cattle drive-up from Texas. I went looking for him when I heard the kind of man Cutter was. I found Thomas in a camp outside of Hays City 3 days before the robbery. He told me Cutter had a hold over him, a debt and a threat, and that he wanted out but could not see the way. I told him I was going to get him out. And Cutter found out you were there." "Cutter approached me the morning of the 14th, she said. "He told me Thomas was going to be inside the bank when it happened. He told me that if I wanted Thomas to walk out alive, I needed to stand on the corner of 2nd and Commerce and tell him when the marshal's deputy turned his rounds. That is all I did. I did not know a man would die. I did not know there would be shooting. Cutter told me it was going to be clean. And where is Thomas now? Her jaw tightened. I don't know. When the shooting started, Thomas was supposed to run. I don't know if he ran or if Cutter did something to him. I have not been able to find out because the moment the marshal's office started looking for witnesses, I ran myself because I was standing on that corner and I knew exactly how it would look. Owen was quiet for a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. Did anyone see Cutter give you those instructions? A woman named Clara Beale. She runs a boarding house on the south side of Hayes City. She was at her upstairs window when Cutter came to speak with me in the street. I don't know if she heard what he said, but she saw us together. She paused. There is also a man in Cutter's outfit, or there was a man named Samuel Prout who knew about the arrangement Cutter had with Thomas. He and Thomas were friendly. He told me the night before that I should get Thomas and get out and not wait for morning. Prout's still with Cutter's outfit. I don't know. I don't know where any of them are. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Abbott, I did not kill Robert Greer. I did not plan a robbery. I am not what that warrant says I am. But I am aware that I am also not innocent of everything, and I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. I am asking you to consider that there is a story here that hasn't been told to anyone who had the authority to do something about it. Owen stood up. He put his hat on his head, and he stood there for one long moment looking at this woman through the bars of a cell in a town that did not particularly care about the complexity of things, and he made a second decision, this one larger than the first. I'll be back, he said. That's what people say when they're not coming back, she said, and it was not bitterness exactly, just a kind of accurate accounting of her experience. I know, he said, but I will. He went back out through the sheriff's office and paused at Hanson's desk. When does she go to Hayes City for arraignment? Judge comes through in about 3 weeks, Hanson said without looking up from his papers. She'll go back with the circuit judge's escort. 3 weeks. Owen did the arithmetic. Hayes City was about 70 miles east. He knew the territory. He knew some of the people in it. He thought about Clara Beale and a boarding house on the south side of Hayes City. And he thought about a man named Samuel Prout who might know where Dale Cutter had gone. And he thought about a young man named Thomas Easton who might be dead in a ditch or might be running scared somewhere on the Kansas plain. He walked out into the bright, hard October sunlight of Caldwell and went to the livery stable where his horse, a gray gelding he called Sergeant, was housed and fed and rested. He spent a few minutes checking the animal's feet and his pack and his provisions, and then he rode east. He had 3 weeks. The $300 in his pocket would last him that long if he was careful. He was always careful. The ride to Hayes City took him 2 full days at a pace that preserved the horse and left him time to think. He stopped the first night at a small ranch outside of Kingman where the owner, a widow named Mrs. Patton who had known his mother slightly and herself not at all, gave him supper and a place in the barn, and asked no questions because the look on his face discouraged them. He thought about Winifred Easton the whole long night. He thought about her voice, and the way it had stayed steady when steadiness must have cost her something. He thought about the logic of her story, not whether it was pretty or sympathetic, but whether it held together structurally, the way you tested a bridge before you put weight on it. It held together. The pieces fit. The detail about the boarding house and the woman at the window, that was the kind of specific, verifiable detail that people making up stories didn't generally include, because it was a detail that could be checked. He also thought, with the honesty that came more easily in the dark than in daylight, that she was one of the most compelling women he had ever encountered, and that this complicated things considerably, and that he was going to have to be very careful to separate what he believed from what he might simply want to believe because she had green eyes and a spine made of something stronger than most people's whole bodies. He arrived in Hayes City on the second afternoon and went first to the marshal's office, where he introduced himself and explained that he had brought in Winifred Easton and was following up on a lead regarding Dale Cutter's current whereabouts. The marshal, a man named Corrigan who was several years older and several degrees more thorough than Sheriff Hanson, listened with the careful attention of someone who had been at this a long time. "Cutter's gone north," Corrigan said. "We think he's running toward the Dakotas. We got word he was seen in Salina about 10 days ago." "What about the Easton woman? You got a position on her level of involvement?" Corrigan rubbed his jaw. "Honestly, that case has bothered me some. The only person who placed her as an active participant was Cutter's own second, a man named Harlan Wade who we arrested at the scene. Wade said she was a lookout. But Wade also had every reason to spread the blame as wide as he could to muddy things. She's not in the same category as the men who were inside that bank. Is there a woman named Clara Beale who runs a boarding house on the south side of town?" Corrigan looked at him sharply. "There is. Why?" "I'd like to speak with her." Clara Beale was a small, direct woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles, and the particular manner of someone who had spent decades watching the world from a position of careful observation, and rarely liked what she saw. She admitted Owen into her sitting room and offered him coffee, which he accepted, and she listened to him explain what he was looking for with an expression that moved gradually from wariness to something more engaged. "I saw Dale Cutter speak with that young woman," she said. "Yes, the morning of the robbery. They were in the street below my window. I couldn't hear what was said. But you saw the nature of the conversation, her manner." Clara Beale was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in its saucer. "She looked frightened," she said finally. "I noticed because she'd been staying in my establishment the previous 2 nights, and she hadn't seemed like a frightened woman. She'd seemed troubled, like someone working through a problem. But when she was talking to that man Cutter, she looked frightened the way people look when someone has gotten hold of something important to them." She paused, like he was holding a card. "Would you be willing to say that to a judge?" Clara Beale looked at him for a long time. Owen had the sense that she was performing some kind of internal calculation that involved not just the facts of the situation but the whole texture of the world as she had experienced it, a world that had not always rewarded women who stood up and said what they'd seen. "Yes," she said, "I would. I've been thinking I should have said something sooner. I saw her in the street after the shooting started and she ran, and I thought a great many things. But mostly I thought someone ought to know that she didn't look like a willing participant in anything that morning." Owen set down his coffee cup and felt something settle in him, some weight redistributing itself. "Thank you, Mrs. Beale." He spent the rest of that day and the following morning asking around about Samuel Prout. This took more persistence and more of the kind of indirect conversation that he was good at, the kind where you didn't ask what you wanted to know directly but approached it from angles, picking up pieces the way you picked up tracks, not all in the same place, but building into a direction. What he found was that Samuel Prout had indeed separated from Cutter's outfit after the Hayes City robbery. The split had apparently been acrimonious. A bartender at the Long Branch, who had heard things in the way that bartenders did, said Prout had called Cutter a murderous fool, and Cutter had put a gun in his face and told him to ride or bleed, and Prout had ridden. Several people thought Prout had gone south, toward Indian Territory. One man thought he'd gone west. Owen considered his options and went with west because it was closer, and because the instinct he'd developed over 6 years of following people told him that a man who had just ridden away from something would keep riding away from it, which generally meant away from the territories where trouble pooled. He found Samuel Prout in a small town called Sun City, 40 miles west of Hayes City, working as a stable hand at the only livery in town. Prout was a lean man in his late 20s, brown-haired and sunburned, with the kind of watchful diffidence of someone who had learned to make himself small and quiet because the world had punished him for being otherwise. Owen approached him in the late afternoon, when the work had slowed, and Prout was brushing down a paint horse in the relative quiet of the stable. He identified himself and stated his business, and he watched Prout's hands go still on the brush. "I'm not going back to Hayes City," Prout said. "I'm not here to take you anywhere," Owen said. "I brought in Winifred Easton. I'm trying to figure out if she belongs in a cell." Prout turned around slowly. His eyes moved over Owen with the quick assessment of a man who had spent time around people whose intentions were not always what they advertised. "She doesn't," he said. "Tell me what you know." Prout was quiet for a moment, then he put the brush down on the rail and he talked. He confirmed everything Winifred had told Owen. The leverage cutter had over Thomas Easton. The arrangement cutter had forced on Winifred. The way cutter had structured things so that multiple people had small pieces of involvement without understanding the whole picture. He said that Thomas Easton had been inside the bank and had been just as surprised as anyone when Cutter's man pulled a gun on the teller. "Thomas didn't shoot anyone," Prout said. "He froze. When the gun went off, he was at the teller window pretending to make a deposit. He ran when the rest of them ran, and I haven't seen him since. He's unaccounted for, far as I know. I hope he's far from here and staying that way." He looked at Owen. "What happens to Winifred? If I can bring this information back in time and get it to the right people, she may not be arraigned at all. Or if she is, she'll have testimony and witnesses to support her account." Prout looked at him for another long moment. "Are you willing to put your name on that? A bounty hunter who goes back and says he might have brought in the wrong person." "I'm willing to put my name on the truth," Owen said. "Whatever that costs me." Prout studied him. Then he nodded slowly. "Then I'll give you a written statement. I can write. It won't be fancy, but it'll be accurate." Owen spent that night in Sun City, and in the morning he had a 4-page handwritten statement from Samuel Prout, carefully signed, describing Dale Cutter's methods and the specific circumstances of the Hayes City robbery as Prout had understood them. He also had Prout's agreement to present himself to Marshal Corrigan in Hayes City within the week, which was more than Owen had hoped for, and which he attributed to something in Prout's character that had never entirely reconciled itself to the life he'd been living. He rode back to Hayes City and spent another morning with Marshal Corrigan, laying out everything he'd found: Clara Beale's account, Prout's written statement, the logical structure of Winifred Easton's own story as she'd told it, and as it was now corroborated. Corrigan listened with the careful attention Owen had appreciated on his first visit, and at the end he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. "The woman in Caldwell's jail may not be the right woman for the right charge," Corrigan said finally. "That is my assessment," Owen said. "You're going to have to go back there and make a formal representation to Sheriff Hanson." "I know. Hanson's not going to love this." "No," Owen agreed. "He's not. And you're going to have to sign a statement saying that in your professional judgment, the evidence you gathered in the course of your investigation materially alters the case against Winifred Easton." Corrigan paused. "That puts your reputation on the line." "I know that too." Corrigan looked at him steadily. "Why?" Owen picked up his hat from the desk and turned it in his hands, which was something he did when he was thinking, or when he was being more honest than was entirely comfortable. "Because she told me the truth from the beginning, and I chose not to hear it until it was easier for me to hear it," he said. "And because the truth is still the truth whether it's convenient or not." Corrigan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, Abbott, let's write this up properly." He was back on the road to Caldwell by early afternoon, riding hard. He had been gone 9 days. He had 11 days before the circuit judge arrived. He was cutting it closer than he liked. The plains of Kansas in October had a beauty that was the specific kind: austere, vast, utterly indifferent to human concern, that Owen had spent his adult life moving through without particularly looking at it. He looked at it now. The grass had gone golden and brown, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only existed at this latitude in the season, deep and clear, and containing nothing that resembled comfort. There were hawks turning in the thermals above the bluffs, and the creek bottoms were dark with cottonwoods going yellow. It was beautiful in the way that something is beautiful when you are suddenly capable of seeing it, which generally required either great happiness or the approach of great change. He thought about what he would say to Winifred Easton when he walked back into that jail. He rehearsed several versions and discarded them all because they were either too formal or too presumptuous or too much of one kind of honest and not enough of another. He settled, eventually, on simply telling her what he'd found and what it meant and letting the conversation go where it went. He arrived back in Caldwell on a Tuesday afternoon, with the wind low and the light slanting gold across the flat Kansas streets. He tied Sergeant at the post outside the sheriff's office and went in, and Hanson looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had expected a complication and is irritated to find himself correct. "Abbott, I need to talk to you about Winifred Easton," Owen said. "I've been to Hays City. I have a corroborating witness and a written statement from a member of Cutter's outfit. The case against her is substantially different from what the warrant suggests." Hanson's expression did a series of things that Owen watched with the patience of someone who had sat across from a great many men arriving at positions they didn't want to occupy. "You're telling me you want to unarrest somebody you just brought me. I'm telling you that new evidence has come to light and that it is your professional obligation and mine to account for it. You already got paid. That's not what this is about." The conversation that followed was lengthy and occasionally heated, and Owen held his ground with the steady, immovable patience that was his particular gift. He was not aggressive and he was not apologetic. He was simply present and accurate and willing to stay in the room as long as it required. He had Pruitt's statement. He had Clara Beale's name and the Hays City Marshal's office as a resource. He had the logic of the thing, assembled carefully, piece by piece, into a structure that Hanson could not dismiss without obviously choosing to do so. In the end, Hanson sent a wire to Corrigan, and the reply came back within 2 hours, and after reading it twice, Hanson stood up from his desk and took the cell key from its hook with the deliberate slowness of a man demonstrating his lack of enthusiasm. Owen walked back to the cell. Winifred was sitting exactly as she had been 9 days before, on the edge of the cot, hands folded, back straight. But when she looked up and saw him, something shifted in her face that she did not entirely succeed in keeping contained, and Owen recognized it as the kind of thing that happens to people when something they had given up hoping for materializes after all. "I said I would come back," he said. "You did," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I found Clara Beale. I found Samuel Pruitt. He gave me a full written statement. Marshal Corrigan in Hays City is satisfied that the warrant against you was issued on incomplete information, and Sheriff Hanson is about to let you out of this cell." She pressed her lips together and looked at the wall for a moment, and Owen realized she was controlling herself very carefully, that there was a lot happening inside her that she was not ready to let out in front of him or Hanson or anyone else. "Thomas," she said. "Did you find anything about Thomas? Pruitt says he ran during the robbery. He believes he got out. He has not been seen since, which suggests he's either hiding well or he's gone somewhere he couldn't easily be tracked from." He paused. "I don't know that he's all right, but I have no evidence he's not." She nodded and swallowed and pressed her hands flat on her knees. "All right." Hanson arrived with the key, unlocking the cell door with unnecessary ceremony, and Winifred Easton walked out of that cell and into the corridor and into the front room of the sheriff's office, and she stood in the thin autumn light coming through the front window, and she breathed. Owen stood a few feet away and watched her and said nothing. Some moments needed to happen without narration. After a moment she turned around and looked at him. Her eyes were bright, but she had not cried, or if she had, it had been in that brief moment when she was looking at the wall and he had looked away. "Thank you," she said. "It's what should have been done," he said. "That's not the same thing as saying thank you." He looked at her. "No," he said, "it's not." He cleared his throat. "You have no money, no horse, and nowhere to go until we establish your full clearance with Hays City. And he stopped. "And you," she said. He had not precisely planned what he said next. It came out with less arrangement than he would have liked. "I owe you something for bringing you in before I heard your story properly," he said. "If you'll let me, I'd like to help you find your brother." She looked at him for a long time. He made himself hold that look without turning away from it, which was harder than he would have expected. "Why?" she asked. "Because I started this wrong," he said. "I'd like to finish it right." Something changed in her expression, not softened exactly, nothing so simple as that, but shifted, like a door that has been closed a long time, opening just a small distance to let in air. "All right, Mr. Abbott," she said. "Where do we start?" They started with a meal, because Winifred had been eating jail food for 9 days and Owen had been eating trail food for 9 days before that. And the Drover's Rest dining room served a passable beef stew that was, in the context of recent weeks, approximately equivalent to a feast. They sat across from each other at a table near the window, and Owen ordered for both of them and then felt faintly awkward about having done so without asking, which was something he hadn't given thought to in a long time. Winifred noticed. "Thank you," she said, "though I'm capable of ordering my own supper." "I know," he said. "I'm out of practice with company." She looked at him. "How long have you been doing this work?" 6 years. "Alone?" "Mostly." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been moving for the past year," she said. "Since our father died and I went looking for Thomas. I've been—" She paused, searching for the word. "Provisional," she said. "Everything has been provisional. I haven't had a home since our farm in Missouri." "Is there a farm to go back to?" She shook her head. "We sold it after my father passed. There wasn't much left anyway. He had debts." She said it without self-pity, just as a fact, something that had happened and been absorbed and moved past. "Thomas and I were going to start something new out here. That's why he came west. He was going to work the drives for 2 seasons and save up, and we were going to have a piece of land." She looked down at the table, and then Cutter happened. "What did Cutter have over him?" Owen asked. "You said a debt and a threat. A debt first." "Thomas borrowed money from a man who turned out to be connected to Cutter's outfit. By the time he realized what that meant, the interest had compounded into something he couldn't pay, and the threat was that they'd say he'd stolen it, that he'd signed a note under a false name, and have him arrested. Thomas was frightened, and he was young, and he didn't know how men like that work." She looked up at him. "He's not a bad person. He's just 22, and he grew up on a farm in Missouri, and nothing in his life prepared him for Dale Cutter." "Not many things prepare a person for Dale Cutter," Owen said. They ate for a while in companionable silence, and Owen found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this was more pleasant than most silences he'd sat in recently. Winifred ate with the concentrated attention of someone very hungry who was not going to let that override their table manners, and there was something honest and appealing about that. "Tell me about yourself," she said eventually. He was momentarily caught off guard by the directness of it. "What would you like to know?" "How does a person end up doing this work?" He considered the honest answer. "I was a deputy marshal in Abilene for 2 years before this," he said. "Then the man I worked for, good man, straight marshal, got shot. Politics changed. The new man was less interested in justice than in contracts and the price of things. I didn't fit that particular arrangement." He paused. "Bounty work lets you be your own employer. Does that make it better?" "It makes it simpler." He looked out the window at the street, where the October evening was bringing people back from wherever they'd been and sending others out toward wherever they were going. "It doesn't always make it right. That's something I'm still working out." She looked at him with a directness that he was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at things. "The way you went back," she said, "after you'd already been paid, that wasn't simple. That cost you something." "It did," he said. "Most people wouldn't have done it." "Most people don't have your eyes looking at them from behind a cell door for 9 days," he said, and then was immediately sorry he'd said it, because it was more than he'd meant to give away, and he wasn't sure the timing was right. Winifred was quiet for a moment. He could see her deciding how to respond to that. Then she said simply, "The stew is quite good." He found himself smiling despite himself. "It is," he said. They arranged their situation practically. Owen had enough money to cover their expenses for a reasonable search, and he established with Winifred that it was a loan only and not a gift, because she was clear about that, and he respected her enough not to argue. She had a few things at the Mallory homestead where he'd found her: a bag, some clothes, a small amount of money she'd earned during the harvest, and they rode out there the following morning to collect them. The Mallory woman, a sturdy and observant person named Ruth who had apparently taken a liking to Winifred during her 4 days of harvest work, received them with the particular mixture of relief and curiosity that tends to follow unexpected complications in otherwise straightforward lives. She gave Winifred her bag and her small savings tin, and she pressed a wrapped parcel of food on Owen with a firmness that did not invite argument, and she said to Winifred, quietly but not so quietly that Owen missed it, "Is he treating you well?" "So far," Winifred said, in a tone that was so precisely calibrated between warm and cautious that Owen filed it away and thought about it later. They rode northeast from Caldwell, following the logic of what they knew. Thomas Easton had been in Hayes City on September 14th. He had run from the robbery. The question was which direction. Owen reasoned through it. A young man from Missouri, frightened, no friends in the immediate area after his split from Cutter, no money to speak of, he would have moved toward something familiar or toward something that promised safety. The cattle drives came up from Texas through this part of Kansas. They had ended for the season, but the camps and the waypoints remained, and the men who worked them knew each other and moved along known routes. He said as much to Winifred as they rode, and she listened carefully and then said, "Thomas has a friend, a man he worked the drive with last year before any of this happened. A man named Percy Sutton who comes from near Independence, Missouri. Thomas mentioned him in a letter. He said Percy had settled somewhere near the Kansas-Missouri line after the drive. You have an address." "A town, not an address. Neosho Falls." He said Percy had people there. Neosho Falls was east and slightly north, a different direction from where Corrigan's information said Cutter had gone, which was a reassuring piece of asymmetry. If Thomas was running from Cutter, he would not run toward Cutter's territory. He would run toward safety, toward a friend. They adjusted their route. The days that followed had the particular quality of time spent in motion with purpose, covering ground, stopping to ask questions, following threads. They stayed at trail stops and small homesteads, Owen negotiating lodging with the quiet competence of someone who had done this for years. The nights were growing colder, the kind of October cold that reminded you that November was not far behind. At night, sitting by fires or in the thin warmth of roadside inns, they talked. They talked about everything. Owen had not talked like this in. He tried to count, and found that the number was embarrassingly large. He talked about his childhood in Ohio, his parents, his 2 years in Abilene and the people he'd known there. Winifred talked about the farm in Missouri, her father who had been a difficult and loving man in approximately equal measure, Thomas who was young and idealistic, and had never entirely learned that the world did not correspond to its own stated intentions. She talked about what she'd been doing in the year since her father's death, working, moving, following Thomas west, managing on very little in the way of resources but a great deal in the way of determination. She was, Owen decided, one of the most capable people he had encountered. This was not a small assessment from a man who had spent 6 years working alone and had come to rely primarily on his own judgment. She saw things quickly. She thought in straight lines. She had a dry, surprising humor that surfaced at unexpected moments and that delighted him every time it did. He was falling in love with her. He recognized this with the slightly stunned quality of a man who has walked into a room expecting it to be empty and found it fully occupied. He had not been looking for this. He had not thought himself available for it, in some vague and unexamined way that had more to do with the life he'd been living than any conscious decision. But there it was, happening whether he'd arranged for it or not, and the sheer realness of it was hard to argue with. He did not say anything about it. They had only known each other a short while, and she had just spent 9 days in a jail cell on his account, and the timing seemed profoundly wrong. He filed it away and concentrated on the work. They reached Neosho Falls on the 6th day out of Caldwell. on a Friday afternoon when the town was busy with its end-of-week commerce. It was a small place, quieter than the cattle towns, with a general store and a grist mill and a church with a crooked steeple, and it sat beside the Neosho River where the trees had gone fully gold and were dropping their leaves in a steady, slow rain. Asking after Percy, Sutton took less than 20 minutes. Everyone seemed to know him. He worked at the grist mill and lived in a small house near the river, and when they knocked on his door, he answered it himself, a stocky, open-faced man of about 25, red-haired and very slightly freckled, who looked at Winifred for about 2 seconds and said, "You must be Thomas's sister." Winifred grabbed the door frame. Owen saw it, the quick forward movement she contained, the breath she took. "He's here," she said. "He's been here 3 weeks," Percy Sutton said, and opened the door wider. "Come in. He's going to be so relieved." Thomas Easton was in the back room of Percy's small house, and Owen waited in the front room while Winifred went back, and he listened to the sounds of a reunion happening through a thin wall of voices, a silence, what he thought might be crying, though he did not try too hard to identify it. Percy Sutton made coffee and sat across from Owen and gave him the brief version of how Thomas had arrived half-starved, terrified, convinced that both the law and Cutter's remaining men were looking for him. "He didn't have any part in the shooting," Percy said. "He told me the whole thing. He was sick about that teller who died. He barely slept for 2 weeks." "I believe you," Owen said. "What happens to him now?" Owen thought about it carefully. "The marshal in Hayes City is the relevant authority. Thomas is going to have to face him and tell his story. Given the corroborating accounts I've gathered, and the fact that the shooter has been identified as one of Cutter's men, Thomas may well be looking at a reduced charge or no charge at all. But he has to come forward. Hiding is not a long-term solution." Percy nodded. "He knows that. I think he just needed time to stop shaking before he could do it." Winifred came back into the front room with Thomas beside her. He was a younger, thinner version of her. The same coloring, the same quality of contained intensity, though in him it was more raw and untested, the look of someone who had recently had their understanding of the world substantially revised. He was 22 and he looked at Owen with a wariness that Owen did not take personally. "Mr. Abbott," Winifred said, "this is Thomas." Owen stood and extended his hand. "I've heard a lot about you." Thomas shook his hand cautiously. "Winifred says you went back for her after you'd already—" He stopped. "After I'd already brought her in." "Yes." Owen did not elaborate. The facts were the facts. "Why?" Thomas asked, with the directness of someone young enough to still believe the question deserved a direct answer. "Because the right thing was possible," Owen said, "and I had the means to do it." Thomas looked at him for another moment, and then something in his face shifted, some defensive architecture relaxing slightly. "She said you'd say something like that." Owen glanced at Winifred, who was looking at the middle distance with a carefully neutral expression. "Did she?" he said. "She said you were the most straightforwardly decent person she'd met in a year of looking, and that you were doing your best not to let anyone see it." Owen opened his mouth and closed it again. Winifred was now examining a knot in Percy's floorboards with apparent fascination. Percy Sutton, clearly enjoying all of this, offered a second round of coffee. They stayed 2 days in Neosho Falls. Owen spent the better part of the first day in careful conversation with Thomas, going over the events of September 14th in detail, helping him understand what he would need to say and how to say it, and what the likely outcomes were. Thomas was scared but not a coward, and Owen found himself liking the young man in the uncomplicated way that you like someone who was genuinely trying to do the right thing from inside a situation where doing the right thing was going to cost them something. On the second evening, while Thomas and Percy were in the back of the house, Owen and Winifred sat on the narrow porch of Percy's place and watched the Neosho River move in the fading light. The river was low with the end of summer and the banks were thick with the yellow and orange of the cottonwoods, and it was the kind of evening that made the world seem briefly like something that could be managed. "What do you do now?" Owen asked. "After this?" "Go with Thomas to Hayes City," she said. Make sure he gets a fair hearing. And then she paused. I don't know exactly. Start the thing we were going to start, I suppose. We have a little money. Thomas has his savings from the drives, or most of them. There's land available in this part of Kansas or in the territories. We were going to farm. That plan hasn't changed. It's just been delayed by a very bad year. That's a good plan, Owen said. She looked at him. What do you do now? He was quiet for a moment. The river moved. A kingfisher cut across the water and vanished into the opposite bank's reeds. I've been thinking about that, he said, and I've been at this work for 6 years, and it has been, he chose his words carefully, increasingly difficult to find reasons to continue at it. Not every job has been like yours, most haven't been. But the work is becoming something I don't recognize well enough to be good at. I'm not interested in it in the way I was. What were you interested in before? The law, the actual law, not the instrument of it. The idea that people should be able to live without being preyed upon. He paused. I grew up in Ohio on a small farm. My father worked the same ground all his life. There's something about a piece of land that a person tends properly. I've been riding past it my whole adult life, and I've never stopped to think about why it appeals to me as much as it does. Winifred was very still beside him. That is either the most roundabout or the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me, she said. I'm not good at the direct version, he said. I'm working on it. She looked at the river. Owen. It was the first time she'd used his given name without the Mr. before it, and he registered it the way you registered a change in air pressure, as a signal that something had shifted. Yes, he said. I do not make decisions quickly or carelessly, she said. I want you to know that before I say what I'm about to say. All right. I have thought about you every day since you rode away from that jail cell. Not just about what you were doing, whether you'd find what I'd told you was real, but about you, specifically. The way you think. The way you held your hat when you were being more honest than felt safe. The way you asked me to tell my story as if it genuinely mattered to you what it was. He was quiet. I'm not going to pretend I know what that adds up to in the long run, she said, but I think you should know it, because you said something roundabout about land, and I am telling you directly that if you are trying to say something else, you should probably say it. He turned to look at her. In the fading evening light, her face was all warmth and complexity, the auburn of her hair gone almost copper in this light, her green eyes steady and honest and braver than most of what he'd seen. I came back, he said. I came back before I knew what was waiting. I went 9 days across Kansas because you told me something true, and I heard it too late, and I couldn't leave that alone. He paused. And I would very much like to not ride away from this when it concludes, from you, if that is something you would consider. She was quiet for a moment. The river murmured. A frog somewhere began to tune up for the evening. I would consider it very carefully, she said, and there was something in her voice that was warm and careful and exact. And Owen felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, the specific lightness of not carrying something alone. They rode to Hays City the following morning, all 4 of them, Owen and Winifred, Thomas and Percy, who had offered to come as a character witness, and whose steady reliability had become, over the past 2 days, something Owen valued. Marshal Corrigan received them with the thoroughness and care that Owen had already come to expect from him. Thomas sat in Corrigan's office for 3 hours and told everything he knew, not just his own story, but everything about Cutter's operations, the way the outfit worked, the names and methods and the routes Cutter used. It was, as testimony went, thorough and damning, and Corrigan listened carefully and said very little until Thomas had finished. Then he looked at Thomas Easton for a long time and said, "Son, you were in a bank when a man was killed. I'm not going to pretend that carries no weight, but what you've given me here is material assistance in the investigation of a much larger case, and given what Mr. Abbott has established about the nature of the circumstances, the district attorney and I are going to need to have a conversation about what the right charge is for someone who was in your position." Thomas swallowed hard. "Does that mean," "It means I'm not putting you in a cell today," Corrigan said. "It means I need you to stay in the territory and be available. It means this is not finished. But it also means I'm going to do this properly." He looked at Owen. "You did good work on this, Abbott." "I should have done it before I left Caldwell," Owen said. "You did it," Corrigan said. "That's what matters." The outcome, ultimately, was this. After 3 weeks and several conversations between Corrigan and the district attorney and the circuit judge, Thomas Easton was charged with a reduced count of material presence during the commission of a robbery, which carried a fine and a period of supervised obligation to Hays City, during which time he was to remain available and continue providing information about Cutter's operations. He was not imprisoned. He would be watched. He was, in the language of the law, a cooperative witness, and that distinction mattered enormously. Winifred cried briefly and privately after she heard. Owen knew about it only because Percy told him, with the unself-conscious informality of a man who had grown up around people who expressed their feelings freely and thought everyone else did too. The matter of Dale Cutter remained open. He was somewhere in the Dakotas, or heading there, and Marshal Corrigan had sent descriptions north and west. Owen thought about it and then had a conversation with Corrigan about taking the warrant. "You want to go after Cutter," Corrigan said. "Not particularly," Owen said. "But I'm good at finding people, and the man has caused substantial harm to people he paused. "To people I care about, I'd like to see him answered for." Corrigan looked at him. "I'll give you the paper," he said. "But Abbott, this is not a score to settle. This is law." "I know the difference," Owen said. He did not go immediately. He had some other business to attend to first. He found Winifred in the small rented room. She and Thomas were sharing at a boarding house on the quieter end of Hays City's Main Street. He knocked and she answered, and he said he needed to speak with her, and she let him in, and they stood in the room with its small window and its simple furniture and the particular awkwardness of a moment that had been building for several weeks. "Corrigan is giving me the warrant for Cutter," he said. She was quiet. "I need to go north," he said. "Into the Dakotas, probably. It may take most of the winter." "I understand," she said. Her voice was even. "I wanted to ask you something before I went." She looked at him. "Ask it." He had rehearsed this even less than the other conversations. He was finding, better at doing things than planning them, and the thing he wanted to say was simple enough that rehearsal would only have made it worse. "I would like to come back to you," he said. "Not passing through, not provisional. I would like to come back and help you and Thomas find your piece of land and stay there, if you'll have me." The silence that followed was long enough to qualify as its own kind of event. Outside the window, Hays City went about its business, boots on boardwalks, a wagon somewhere, the distant complaint of a dog. "That's a very large thing to ask for," Winifred said. "I know. You've known me for less than a month. I know that too. And you're proposing to go off into the Dakotas in the middle of winter and then come back, and what farm?" "Yes," he said. "If you'll have me. Eventually. If after the winter and after I've come back and we've had time to know each other properly, you want that. I'm not asking you to decide now. I'm asking you to not send me away." She looked at him for a very long time, and in her face he could see everything she was thinking, because she was not a woman who hid things well or particularly tried to, and what he saw was real enough to make his breath go shallow. "Don't get killed in the Dakotas," she said. "I'll do my best," he said. She stepped forward and she put her hand against his face, the flat of her palm against his jaw, which had not been touched by anyone with tenderness in longer than he could accurately remember, and she looked at him very steadily and she said, "Come back." He covered her hand with his and held it there for a moment and said, "I will." He kissed her then. It was not dramatic and it was not impulsive. It was as steady and deliberate as everything else about him, and it was warm, and she kissed him back with a warmth that answered everything he hadn't found the words for, and when it ended, they stood together for a moment in the small room with the winter coming through the window and something between them that was solid enough to stand on. He left for the Dakotas the next morning. The weeks that followed tested every piece of Owen Abbott, that had been forged through 6 years of this work. The Northern Plain in November and December was a place of serious, relentless intention. The wind had a weight to it that pressed you down, and the sky closed in and flattened everything, and the cold was the kind that got inside clothing and machinery and eventually thoughts. He tracked Cutter through 2 towns and a winter camp south of the Black Hills, following accounts from traders and from the network of men who moved goods and information across the territory with the efficiency that the frontier required. He found Cutter in a place called Ragged Creek, a loose settlement of maybe 30 souls on the western edge of what would become South Dakota, in a cabin that he'd clearly been occupying for weeks, well supplied and moderately comfortable, which told Owen that Cutter had money left from the robbery and had decided to wait out the winter somewhere remote. Owen did not approach the cabin alone or recklessly. He had ridden through Ragged Creek's loose settlement and found 2 men who served, in the absence of formal authority, as something like peace officers. Practical men who knew Cutter was trouble and who agreed, with the careful neutrality of people responsible for a community, to assist in the arrest. They went to the cabin at dawn, Owen in front, the 2 local men covering the back, and when Cutter came to the door and saw them, his hand went to his gun and Owen said clearly and calmly, "That will go worse for you than this already is." Cutter hesitated. Owen kept his eyes on the man and his voice level and said, "There are warrants out of Hays City and your outfit has already talked to the marshal. There is nothing to be gained here by making this worse." There was a very long, very cold moment. Cutter lowered his hand. The arrest was made cleanly without further violence, which was what Owen had intended, and which was not how everyone would have handled it, but it was how he handled things when he could. He transported Cutter south through weeks of winter road that were long and largely silent, Cutter making intermittent attempts at conversation and negotiation that Owen did not encourage, and arrived in Hays City in January to deliver Dale Cutter into Marshal Corrigan's custody. Corrigan shook his hand. The paperwork was completed. The bounty $500 this time was paid, and Owen stood outside the marshal's office in the January cold and looked at the flat gray Kansas sky and felt the particular hollowness of a completed job and the particular fullness of having somewhere to be. He went to the boarding house on the quieter end of the main street. He was aware as he walked that he must look something like what he was, a man who had spent 2 months in the Dakotas winter in pursuit of someone dangerous, with all that implied for the state of his coat and his face and the general impression he made. He knocked on the door anyway. Thomas Easton answered. He looked at Owen for 1 second and then turned around and shouted, "Winifred," with the volume of someone who had been trained to project his voice across farmland. Winifred came from the back of the house. She was in a plain, dark dress, her hair pinned up practically, and she was carrying a letter she'd been writing, and when she saw him she stopped. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. She set the letter down on the nearest surface and came to the door and stood in it looking at him, and he looked at her. And all the cold months and the long miles were present in that moment in the way that difficulty is present in something that has come through it as evidence, as proof. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm very well," he said, and meant it in more ways than she might have understood. She stepped back and let him in out of the cold. The next months were the beginning of everything real. Owen stayed in Hays City through the winter, while Thomas's supervised obligation continued, and while the legal proceedings against Cutter made their way forward. Dale Cutter was tried in February on charges including robbery, conspiracy, and the death of Robert Greer. The testimony against him was substantial. Samuel Prout came in from Sun City as he had promised, and 2 other former members of the outfit who had been given arrangements with the prosecutor in exchange for their accounts. The jury took 4 hours. The sentence was 20 years in the federal penitentiary. When Marshal Corrigan sent word to Owen, Owen sat with the news for a moment and then told Winifred, who pressed her lips together and was quiet for a while and then said, "Good," with a simplicity that contained a great deal. Thomas completed his obligation in March, paid his fine from his savings, and was formally released from his supervised status. He was, to Owen's eye, a substantially different person from the raw and frightened young man who had arrived at Percy Sutton's house in the fall, still young, but more settled, more considered, like someone who had been taken apart and put back together with slightly better hardware. Percy came back in the spring, because Percy, it turned out, was the kind of person who showed up and stayed, and Owen had begun to think of him as something close to family, which was a thought he found he liked more than he'd expected. Owen and Winifred had the rest of the winter and the early spring to know each other in the way that daily proximity allows, not the compressed intensity of a journey with a purpose, but the quieter, revealing texture of ordinary life. They ate meals together and argued mildly about things like the best approach to a negotiation, or whether a particular piece of land they'd ridden past was being managed correctly, and found that arguing with each other was as engaging as agreeing. Owen told her about things he had not told anyone, the 2 jobs he'd gotten wrong, the man he'd killed in his second year who had drawn on him and left him no choice, the long, careful loneliness of 6 years in motion. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 12, and the years of being the woman of the household before she was ready for it, and the strange grief of losing the farm, which had been the last physical marker of a life that was gone. They were very careful with each other, not out of caution exactly, but out of respect, the sense that this thing between them was real enough to deserve care. And underneath the care was a warmth that grew steadily, banked like a good fire, and that came out in smaller and larger ways every day. In the hand she put on his arm when he was talking about something hard, in the way he automatically positioned himself between her and whatever he perceived as potential trouble, not because she needed protecting, but because the instinct to place himself there had become as natural as breathing. He asked her properly in April, when the Kansas spring was doing its brief, extravagant thing with wildflowers and new grass, and a sky so wide and blue it seemed almost theoretical. They were on horseback outside town, riding over a piece of land they'd been considering, an 80-acre homestead claim that was available under the terms of the Homestead Act, with good water access and a stand of trees along the eastern edge, and soil that Owen had gotten down on one knee to examine, not for the purpose of proposing but genuinely to look at the soil, which was good dark loam and which had made Winifred laugh. He looked up from the soil and found her looking down at him from her horse with an expression that was equal parts amusement and something much warmer, and he thought, "There is no better time than this," and said, "Winifred, will you marry me?" She looked at him. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the new grass. The wind moved the wildflowers. "Yes," she said, as simply and directly as she did everything, and then she got down from her horse and he was standing and they were face to face in the April grass, and she put both hands on either side of his face the way she had in the room in Hayes City in October and said, "I have been waiting for you to ask for a long time." "I wanted to be sure," he said. "Were you sure?" "Since about November," he said. "Owen Abbott," she said, "you are the most deliberately patient man I have ever known." And she kissed him in the April grass with the meadowlark still going and the wildflowers doing their temporary beautiful thing, and it was as right as anything he had ever done. They were married in June, in a small ceremony in Hayes City that was attended by Thomas and Percy and Ruth Mallory, who had driven in from near Medicine Lodge with her husband and a large quantity of food. Clara Beale came from her boarding house, and Marshall Corrigan was there because Owen had come to think of him as a man worth knowing. The minister was a thin, serious-faced man who performed the ceremony with genuine feeling, and who said afterward that he had rarely presided over a wedding where both parties seemed to have thought as carefully about the commitment they were making. Winifred wore a dress of blue-gray wool that she and Ruth Mallory had made together in the weeks before the wedding, simple and well-made, and her hair was down, which she almost never wore it, and Owen stood beside her in his best coat, which was the only coat he owned, and said his vows with the same directness that characterized everything he did, looking straight at her, meaning every word. Thomas cried, briefly and without particular embarrassment, and Percy handed him a handkerchief with the unfazed practicality of a good friend. They filed their homestead claim on the 80 acres east of Hayes City in July and began building. Owen had construction skills from his Ohio youth that he had not employed in years and found came back with reassuring reliability. Thomas worked alongside him, and Percy came out on his days off from a freighting job he'd taken in town. And by August they had a house, not large, 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, but solidly built, with walls that would hold against the Kansas winter and a fireplace that drew properly and a porch facing west toward the sunset. Winifred made the interior into something that felt, with remarkable speed, like the word home curtains at the windows, a kitchen that was organized according to its own logic, a small shelf of books that had been accumulated from various sources over the course of their travels, and that Owen added to whenever he passed through a town with a general store that sold them. There were not many books in most general stores in Kansas in 1879, but Owen had developed a habit of looking. They turned the land. Owen had more capital than most new homesteaders. The bounty work had paid steadily if not generously for 6 years, and he had spent little. He bought good stock, 2 draft horses, a milk cow, chickens, and a small flock of sheep that Winifred had specifically requested, and that Thomas had professed to find inexplicable until he actually worked with them and came around gradually over the course of a summer. The work was hard and unromantic in its details, and Owen found that he did not mind this. He had spent 6 years in motion and had forgotten what it felt like to work ground, the specific fatigue of it, the specific satisfaction, the way a field you had put into something came back to you at harvest in a way that could not be replicated by any other kind of work. He got up before dawn and worked until dark and fell asleep with the kind of completeness that only physical labor produces, and he woke beside Winifred every morning and thought, with a consistency that surprised him, that this was what he wanted. He was finished with bounty work. He had not made any formal announcement of this, but he had not taken a warrant since Cutter, and when Corrigan mentioned another job in passing, Owen said, politely and clearly, that he was farming now, and that his interest in tracking men across the territories was at an end. Corrigan had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Good," with a satisfaction that suggested he had been waiting for Owen to arrive at this conclusion. Thomas found his footing that first year in the way that young men do when the circumstances finally give them room, by discovering what he was good at and doing a great deal of it. He was good with livestock and good with figures, and had an instinct for the mechanical that led Owen to give him increasing responsibility for the equipment. By fall, he was talking about filing his own claim on an adjacent piece of land, and by November he and Percy had gone in on 160 acres together to the south, which had led to some ribbing from Owen about partnerships, and which Thomas had received with the dignified composure of a man who was 23 and had grown up considerably in the past year. The first winter on the land was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, but the house held, and the animals were sheltered, and they had laid in enough provisions that the worst of it was manageable. Owen and Winifred spent the long evenings by the fire, reading, talking, playing cards with Thomas and Percy on the nights they came over, which was most nights because Percy had become, in the quiet organic way of these things, part of the family, and Thomas's land was close enough that the ride between them took no longer than a few minutes. On the coldest nights when the wind was serious about itself, and the snow was doing what Kansas snow did in January, they lay in the dark of their loft and talked about the future with the particular freedom that the dark allows, plans and ideas and things they wanted, said aloud in the warm enclosure of a good marriage. And Owen found that he had more to say about the future than he'd ever had before in his life, because he had never previously had one that looked like this. In the spring of 1880, Winifred told him she was pregnant. She told him in the practical, direct way she told him everything, standing in the kitchen in the early morning with coffee in her hand, and he had set his own cup down and stood up and held her for a long time without saying anything, which she permitted, and which she later told him was the right response. Their son was born in November of 1880, in the house Owen had built, attended by a midwife from Hayes City named Mrs. Carmichael, who was thoroughly competent, and who said afterward that it had been as uncomplicated a birth as she'd attended in 20 years, which Owen received with profound relief. They named the boy James Robert Easton Abbott James for Owen's father, Robert for the bank teller who had died in Hayes City on a September morning that had set everything in motion. Thomas held his nephew the evening after the birth with the careful solemnity of a young man suddenly aware that the stakes of everything had changed, and Percy stood beside him and looked at the baby with the expression of someone encountering a piece of information that rearranged other things. Winifred, in the bed in the warm room with the lamplight making everything amber and the November cold locked outside where it belonged, looked across at Owen who was sitting in the chair beside her, and she said, "Are you happy?" He looked at her and at the child and at the room and thought about the October morning 2 years ago when he'd ridden into Caldwell with her wrists bound to his saddle horn, and neither of them knowing what the other was or what was about to be asked of them. "Yes," he said. It was not a complicated answer. It was exactly as simple as it sounded. The years that followed were good years, not without difficulty, because difficulty on the frontier was a constant, and the land and the weather and the market did not arrange themselves for anyone's convenience. There was a summer of drought and a winter that lost them 2 of the sheep, and a set of years when the wheat came in at prices that made everything tighter than comfortable. Owen supplemented their income for 2 seasons doing work for Marshal Corrigan's office that was purely investigative and never required him to track anyone across any territory contract work, examining evidence, interviewing witnesses, the part of the law that relied on thinking rather than writing. He was good at it, and Corrigan valued him, and it kept the books balanced through the difficult years without taking him away from the land in any significant way. James grew from an infant into a boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's jaw, and a personality that seemed to have been assembled from both of them in roughly equal proportion, direct, curious, with a dry humor that he deployed at unexpected moments, and that made Owen and Winifred look at each other across whatever table or field they were occupying with the shared delight of parents encountering themselves in a new configuration. In the winter of 1882, Winifred had another son. They named him William, and he was born with more volume and insistence than his brother had managed, a fact that Mrs. Carmichael noted with cheerful professional interest, and he fulfilled this early promise by being, throughout childhood, the louder and more immediately determined of the 2 brothers, which produced dynamics that kept the household interesting. Thomas, by this time, had built himself a proper house on his claim to the south with Percy's help, and the 2 of them had expanded their stock and their acreage and were by any measure doing well. Percy had become, in the intervening years, so thoroughly embedded in the fabric of this extended family that it was difficult to remember a time when he had been simply a man Thomas had worked a cattle drive with. He was Thomas's partner in the agricultural sense, and his closest friend, and the kind of solid, constant presence that a family like this needed the way land needed water, quietly and fundamentally. Clara Beale came out to visit twice in these years, making the journey from Hayes City on the stage with the specific purposefulness of someone who has decided that a thing is worth the trouble and will not be deterred by the inconvenience. She sat at Owen and Winifred's table and drank coffee and held William, who was at a stage of being held that he tolerated briefly before demanding his freedom, and she said to Winifred on her second visit, "I should have come forward right after the robbery," with the tone of someone who had been carrying that quietly. You came forward when it mattered, Winifred said. It would have mattered sooner. It would have, Winifred agreed, and covered the older woman's hand with hers for a moment. But here we are, here we are. Owen, passing through the room, heard those 3 words and thought of everything they contained. The circuitous, costly, improbable route that had led from an October morning in Caldwell to a kitchen in Kansas with a baby hollering in the next room and a brother on the South 40, and a woman at the table whose life had run through so many difficult things and come out the other side of them into this. In the spring of 1883, a letter arrived from Thomas. Owen read it at the kitchen table and looked up. Percy proposed to a woman in town, he said. Winifred looked up from the bread she was shaping. Which woman? He doesn't say which woman. He says a woman in town, in what appears to be deliberate strategy. Winifred made a sound that meant she was filing this away for future conversation, and went back to the bread. The woman turned out to be a schoolteacher named Alma Grant, who had come to Hays City from Illinois 2 years before, and who turned out to be the kind of person who got along with everyone by being thoroughly herself, which was a quality that had clearly appealed to Percy. The wedding was in October, and the family turned out for it in the way that families do Owen and Winifred and James, who was 3 by now and had very firm opinions about the seating arrangements, and William in Winifred's arms, and Thomas standing up as Percy's witness, with an expression of uncomplicated happiness that made Owen think the world was capable of coming right in the end. After the ceremony at the table, with the food and the noise and the particular warmth of a gathering that contains people who genuinely like each other, Owen sat beside Winifred, and she leaned her shoulder against his in the unconscious, complete way of 2 people who have been together long enough that proximity is as natural as breath. James was asleep against her other side, worn out by the day. William was in Thomas's arms, demonstrating his opinions about something. Owen looked at all of it, the table and the people and the good light, and thought about the warrant and the cold morning and the 43 miles, and about the 9 days he'd ridden across Kansas chasing a story he'd almost refused to hear, and about what it would have cost both of them if he'd stayed comfortable. "What are you thinking about?" Winifred asked, not looking at him. "The beginning," he said. She turned her head. "Which part?" "All of it. The morning I rode you into Caldwell, the cell, the 9 days. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you sorry for any of it?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew to think about things. He was sorry for the 9 days she'd spent in a cell because he had not listened soon enough. He would carry that. He was not sorry for anything that had come after. "I'm sorry for my part of the hard parts," he said. "Not for any of it." She put her hand on his and left it there and looked back at the table and all the life that was present at it, and she said, "Neither am I." James stirred in his sleep beside her and resettled himself more firmly against her arm, and William was put down at some point and immediately went to investigate something under the table, and Thomas was telling Percy something that made Percy laugh, and the candles on the table were doing what candles did on October evenings in Kansas, burning steadily against the dark, holding it back, making the circle of warmth they occupied feel, for the moment, like everything. Outside, the Kansas night was vast and cold and indifferent in the way it had always been, the stars so numerous and so clear that they seemed to be the dominant feature of the world rather than the sky above it. Tomorrow there would be work, because there was always work and seasons, and the particular ongoing negotiations of a life built on land that required tending. There would be hard years and easy years and years, where the difference was not entirely clear until they were over. But tonight the candles were burning, and the family was together, and Owen Abbott, who had spent 6 years moving alone across the territory between one warrant and the next, sat at a table in the golden warmth of a good evening and knew, with the certainty that comes when you have thought something through to its true end, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The road that had brought him here had been strange and long and not always what he would have chosen. A woman with her wrists bound to a saddle horn, a cell door closing, A voice asking him to listen. He had listened. He had ridden back out. He had found the truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was this: the good table, the living warmth, the woman whose hand was in his, the son's, the family extending in every direction, and the long, unbroken run of ordinary, extraordinary days stretching out ahead of them, season by season, towards something he no longer needed to name because he was already living inside it.